and they just watch it later, which makes sense because time zones.
Makes sense. Yeah.
All right, it is now 11 a.m. EST. We are live on YouTube. Hello, welcome everybody. Awesome, I'm going to jump right into it. Hello, welcome everybody. Really excited today. We have Kevin from the Truffle team. I know we've done a little bit of work with Truffle already, and like on Friday we had our DeFi project that we built with Truffle, which was fantastic. Kevin's here to go even deeper into Truffle, teach us even more. Truffle has a lot of really powerful tools that can help us develop and build our smart contracts and build full scale full stack dApps as well. So really excited to have him. Kevin, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Patrick. Can everyone hear me okay? Well, Patrick, all good on the audio? Sweet.
Sound good.
All right, so I'll go ahead and share my screen. So I just need to juggle a few things here. All right, hopefully you can see that, and I'll go full screen with the slides.
Yep, looks good.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Patrick. All right, yeah, so yeah, thank you, Patrick, for having us at this session. As mentioned, this is going to be a deep dive into the Truffle suite. Quick clarification as well, it was originally going to be both Josh Quintal and myself running this, but unfortunately Josh has a family thing, so he's actually out today, so it's just going to be myself. Yeah, so in terms of agenda, what we're going to be covering, I've kind of broken it down into a couple of parts. I'll start in a moment with intro, just a kind of background on myself, just very brief. And then the first kind of third of this is going to be pretty high level, just for folks that maybe need a refresher on what Truffle is, or maybe you're coming from another stack or another chain or another protocol and you perhaps haven't used Truffle. So we'll go pretty rapidly through that, and I'll just give this sort of 10,000 feet view of what Truffle is, and specifically kind of just going through the different tools in the suite, because it might be that you've just used Truffle and perhaps haven't used other things. I'll also, in that sort of section, talk about Truffle boxes, which are awesome as a learning resource or a hacking resource as well. And then the kind of second part, or the sort of second half, or 2/3 approximately, will be a little more intermediate to advanced. Just to call out some of the things that we'll cover. We'll look at something called Truffle plugins. Specifically called this one out because I think it's a pretty neat hackathon topic, or potentially hackathon thing. And something that's very easy to perhaps wrap some functionality that you've already built or a hack that you're already working on into a plugin potentially. I will talk about something called GANACHE forking, where you can actually fork the state of another chain. Very often that's mainnet, and work with it as if it's a local GANACHE instance, which is really neat, particularly for DeFi-based things or stuff where you want to get that data from mainnet, and kind of mirror that and kind of work with that. Without obviously incurring high gas costs and latency and all the other things that would just not make doing that on mainnet directly feasible. I threw in something as well which is a pretty new feature, and again I think pertinent for a hackathon, and that's actually a means of debugging verified contracts without needing the source for them locally, because it will actually do that. So again, you may have used the Truffle debugger before. If not, I'll kind of show that in context. But specifically this flag that you can pass in, where it will pull the contracts off, assuming they're verified on either Etherscan or Sourcify, and allow you to debug them directly. So it's really neat feature. And then I'll close out with a quick walkthrough of Truffle Teams. I'll kind of infuse that throughout a little bit as well, which is our newest product. And again, I think hopefully, theoretically quite useful for hackathons as well, particularly a couple of features within that, which I'll show. And then, as you can see there, kind of Q&A. And just on that point of questions, I'll keep an eye on the questions box as I go through this. I might need to kind of come out of full screen to kind of check in on that. Typically how I do it, if there is, sort of clarifications or quick, answers, then I'll answer them in line as we're going through. If it's a longer form answer, I'll park it towards the end. But yeah, throw things in anytime, and I'll try my best to keep an eye on that. And then you can see the kind of big fancy graphic on the right here. To give some context as we go through this, I just kind of sprinkled some hackathon ideas throughout. As I mentioned, I think Truffle plugin is a neat one. And I've put a few more. And it may even be not the core of your hack, but just something you kind of blend into the hack, that makes it easier for folks to use, or more tightly integrated into things. But yeah, I'll call that as we go through. But look out for that kind of ridiculously oversized label as we go through the material today. Cool. All right. So yeah, just very briefly about me. My role within Truffle is the head of training and ecosystem engineering, and kind of what that means is kind of doing sessions like this, and working with firms and individual developers on the ground, kind of getting them up to speed, doing workshops, etc. And increasingly, just kind of working with the ecosystem just to help folks build and make amazing things. And then just longer form background, I've been in software development more like 15 years now, many different hats, different paradigms, different technology stacks. And I just want to call out decentralization for the win, because I'm hugely passionate about decentralization as a thing, and as a something that we need kind of as a counterbalance to the inherent centralization of things, or at least that's kind of been the case up until relatively recently. So just to kind of put that out there. Cool. All right. So kind of jumping into the first third or thereabouts, where it's pretty, just again, expectation setting. This is pretty high level. So, if you've used Truffle and, some of the other tools in the suite before, just bear with us, because this, might be a little bit basic, but, we'll get through this pretty rapidly. Okay. Just briefly, what is Truffle? As you probably know already, a suite of tools, and the kind of mantra, this may have changed, I don't know, I've taken this from our site, is about helping developers who have an idea for a decentralized app, bring that to, kind of realize that, as comfortably as possible. And it is actually, it's a bit confusing. And again, if you're kind of new to Truffle, you might think, well, yeah, I've used Truffle, but because Truffle Suite, sounds like, it's just kind of Truffle, right? There's actually, a bunch of different tools within the suite. So maybe that you've just used the CLI or command line interface tool. But we actually have more, and that graphic at the bottom here is actually, we actually have, more than that. We have Truffle teams, and we have like lots of kind of sub projects on GitHub under our org as well. So yeah, I'll be calling some of those out as we go through. Just to unpack it a little further, really, what is it? Kind of going a little bit deeper. It's really about mirroring, as completely as possible a blockchain environment, and all the kind of constructs that that make that up. Everything from accounts, because obviously that's an important thing to do anything with, with the chain, mirroring, as logically as possible, nodes or mining nodes, and things like the RPC interfaces that are used to send transactions to them and so on. And really with the goal of obviously, as frictionally as possible, allowing you to, model, build, iterate, etc. And then obviously, deploy or migrate, to a given chain as well. Download wise, gosh, these numbers doesn't really matter, but we've had, I think, 7 million plus downloads aggregate across all the suite, and then most of our stuff is open source. I only kind of say most of, because Truffle Teams, which I'll be showing later, is currently closed source, and that's really just because it's a SaaS product, and we'll potentially open up or open source some of that over time. But everything else that you see is open source, and our GitHub org is /Truffle Suite, and then at the bottom here, you can just see some of the firms that use our tooling as well. Everything from kind of household name tech firms through to financial services, governments, and so on, government contractors. Cool. Okay, so what's new in the suite? And again, even if you use Truffle a bit, you may be perhaps not aware of some of these things. Just called out a few things, recent developments. Obviously, Truffle Teams, which I mentioned already, and I'll won't go any deeper on that just now because we'll be looking at it later. Another kind of relatively recent kind of development, I guess, is the fact we're now officially multi-chain. We're no longer kind of intrinsically tied to Ethereum. That will always be first class thing for us, but we now have support for some other chains, and that list invariably grow over time. Just a couple that I've mentioned here, Quarter and Tezos. And then the last one, again, this is pretty new in the sense of like a month or two old, is we now have some Filecoin and IPFS integration directly baked into the CLI. It's on a kind of like, I think, labeled or tagged branch right now. So it's kind of more kind of just for testing. But as we move towards Truffle V6, that will become like, fully baked in. And it allows you to just migrate or deploy assets either directly to IPFS or, IPFS through Filecoin, and negotiating, like pinning, storage deals and all the things that Filecoin comprises of. So that's pretty cool that that's something we now have direct support for. Let me just, before I carry on, make sure I'm not missing any gosh, do I have to come out of full screen to check the Q&A? There we go. Oh, so aspect ratio looks vertical. Is that the case for other folks or yourself too, Patrick? Is it looking weird from a aspect ratio perspective?
Yeah, it's a little far away.
Sorry, guys.
Can you if you make your screen a little bit smaller, or just the VS Code, if you like.
Well, I just kind of came out of full screen now, but when I'm in full screen, is it still funky?
Can you go back into full screen?
I'm back in full screen now, where I should be.
Looks exactly the same.
Oh gosh, I think what happened, let me, sorry guys, let me stop sharing. I think maybe I inadvertently just shared the, I don't know, didn't share. Oh man, I don't know. I think when I shared my screen, it didn't share the one that when I went to full screen, because I did full screen my Google Slides window, but I think maybe it wasn't sharing that view, if that makes sense. So you guys were stuck seeing the non-full screen view.
Yep.
All right, let me try one more time. If not, then what I'll just do is maximize that window without going into full screen. Let me just try one more time of sharing. Sorry about that. Oops. Share screen. Let's try again. Oh, I think maybe I know why. Because I was sharing desktop 1, and then when I full screened it, it was. Wait a sec. That may still not be.
We can see the slides now.
Oh, you couldn't even see the slides before.
Yeah, no.
Oh man. Okay. Yeah, no, my apologies. Thanks for pointing that out. How about that? Is that better? I mean, I know it's not quite.
Yeah. This is the slides. Yep.
Yeah. Well, my God. Oh gosh, sorry, you couldn't see that. That sucks. Okay. Yeah, I think what had happened is when I did. Doesn't normally happen, to be honest, but some weird Zoom thing going on that it did when I clicked share screen. I just shared my desktop 1, as it was pointing out, and then I think when it full screened it, shared on another kind of virtual screen, or like desktop 2, or I mean on Mac OS, as you can see. But can you see that? I mean, it's not full screen, but is that reasonable?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, all right. Yeah, well, sorry about that. You didn't see any of the prior stuff, but then
it might be different for the VS Code, and when you go back to the VS Code, just make the text bigger. I think
I will. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because
cool.
I'm aware I'm on a pretty largish monitor, so the res is pretty low.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Well, high. Sorry, I guess. Okay, cool. Yeah, so thanks for clarifying. I'm glad I spotted that sooner. Without going through all the material, and you're like, what is he talking about? Okay, cool. So yeah, I know that's not full screen, so apologies for that, but hopefully it's good enough and you can see it. Cool. So I don't think there's anything you missed visually there. I'll just carry on. So yeah, just to kind of pick up, just go through very briefly just the tools in the suite, and then briefly talk about boxes, and then we'll shift gears to some more kind of intermediate up stuff. So yeah, Truffle itself, just to kind of pick back up, is a command line tool, and again, I'm sure a lot of you have used it or perhaps using it for the hackathon already. Really, the focus of that is the whole contract development lifecycle, and just called out some of the commands you might use along the bottom here, and they comprise of everything from initializing a bare bones project, unboxing a box, which we'll talk about in a bit, and then the kind of workflow you'd expect from compilation, writing tests, running those tests, perhaps debugging, deploying, or migrating, and so on. So that's the whole life cycle was kind of baked into the CLI there. Very actively maintained, I should point out. We're a kind of 70 weekly release cadence. So yeah, I mean, we stridently try and have a release, even if it's just kind of minor stuff every week. I'm currently at 5.1.x, with version 6 in the works. Cool. And then just moving through very briefly, GANACHE, again, probably familiar, but in case you're not, is really just a local node, blockchain environment, that mirrors that of a kind of mining node. Obviously, characteristically, it's designed for development and test and so on. So everything's instantaneous. Transactions are insta-mined to a block and so on. All of that can be tuned, by the way. two flavors of it, and maybe that you've used one or the other. We have a GUI-based version, which I always recommend to folks that are kind of newer to the space, because it helps guide you through the kind of component parts of what's going on. You can see a little snippet of that on the slide here, if you can make that out. As you can see, visually, more visually gives you a view of your accounts that are auto-created, blocks as they're mined, the contracts that have been migrated to the chain, and their associated state, which is really useful. Any events are emitted as well. All of that's kind of there. And then, of course, we have a GUI version, and that can be invoked from the CLI, Truffle CLI directly with Truffle Develop, or you can spin it up standalone as a standalone module as well. And as mentioned, we've got some support coming for other chains, or we already have in there. Another tool in the suite, just kind of moving rapidly through them, is something called Drizzle, and this is pretty lightweight library, and for building the front ends or UIs to your dApps. It's built on top of Redux, so it's just, it's got an underlying store, and really what it does is handles the synchronization of your contract state and any associated transaction data, etc., to a local store. And then we also have a very lightweight kind of component library on top that allows you to kind of wire that up to the front end. If you want to use the components, they're there. Otherwise, you can just kind of more manually create your views to the underlying data, and Drizzle will just handle that synchronization. And then lastly, from a kind of an official tool suite of tools, is something called Truffle Teams. I'll go through this a little bit more formally later, so I'll just kind of put this in context now of the suite itself, but and leave it at that, and we'll kind of have a quick look later. And Teams, as mentioned, is a hosted product, really covering everything, the kind of right-hand side of that, that loop, that sort of infinite loop cycle there. Historically, the tool, as a suite of tools, we've been, pretty much kind of in the left with, smatterings of stuff on the right-hand side there. So things like obviously the coding, the building, the testing, and to some degree the the releasing and deployment, of course, but that has never perhaps been that robust as a story. So Teams is really designed to fill that gap. So we have really nice visual deployment mechanism within it, a CI service. So as you're writing your contracts and the tests are being run, particularly in a kind of multi-person scenario, you can see if the tests that you've written are any point in time failing, or if you use TDD, eventually starting to pass. Things like contract monitoring, a debugger, a visual debugger as well, which I'll give a kind of sneak peek of, again, time permitting later. But yeah, just to kind of reiterate everything on that kind of right hand side, really the kind of DevOps side of things, if you will, as opposed to just the kind of dev piece, adding the ops to it. Cool. Okay. So next up, again, I'm moving pretty quickly through this just because I'm pretty aware that most of you, have used Truffle, I'm sure, to a reasonable degree. But again, in case you haven't, just to call out Truffle boxes. What are they? They're really, best thought of as boilerplate projects, and really focused on, really great for learning, or as starting a new project and kind of using it as a building block. We have three flavors of them. So we have a number that are what we classify as official, that we maintain. So if there's breaking changes in things, either in our tools or other things, then we'll update and maintain them accordingly. We have partner ones. So for example, which you may have seen already, there's a Chainlink box, which is really cool, and again, really great from a learning standpoint. And then we have a long tail of community boxes where folks that are out in the community have perhaps written a box and just get it listed up there, which is really nice, really neat, because just a kind of real mixed bag of different things. It's really cool. And to install one, really easy. It's just Truffle unbox and then the name of the box. Again, I'll show this in a moment, just in context. And then in terms of themes, I've only called out a few here, but we have kind of not that formally kind of classified, but it's there. We have tags associated with them, but just from a sort of high level perspective, some of the themes that we have really getting started. So we have some of our official ones are really good for that, just to help more kind of slowly walk you through things. And in some cases we have an associated tutorial. We have some focused on tokenization, ERC20 or ERC721, and other token standards. We have a lot of front-end themed ones across the kind of popular front-end libraries. React, Drizzle, sorry, not Drizzle, but Vue, Angular, and so on. So if you are kind of at a point where you want to start wiring up a front end to adapt, then it's worth having a look at boxes and just seeing perhaps how they do it, and perhaps mirroring some of that in your own projects. And hackathon idea here, kind of maybe creating your own box is really easy. So we have some docs for it, but really all you need to do is add a trufflebox.json file to the root of the project that basically just contains a bit of metadata about the repository or about the box itself. And then I don't know if this is mandated or not, I need to check, but a little bit of kind of artwork, so just a square kind of thumbnail of what shows up for the box. I know we fall back to something if we don't, if it's not there, so it may be optional, but it's obviously nice to just put a visual, sort of representation of what the box does. It can be just a little hand-drawn thing, whatever, or an emoji, as is the trend these days. And that's it. And then, that will allow people to then just do Truffle unbox, and then the repo name, the org or username / repo name. Or if we make it official, then it will literally just be the name of the box. So you can just do Truffle unbox and then the name of the box. So yeah, again, it wouldn't necessarily need to be a whole hack, that you base around this, but if you've got something that is a standalone project and you wanted to, get it listed as a box, then, just putting it out there that is really, really easy to do. It's not a ton of overhead at all. Cool. All right. So I just kind of wanted to show the process for this as a kind of closing piece of this kind of first third of the session. I may not show it in VS Code yet. I will be jumping over to code in a bit to show other things, but this one, again, I'm working to the assumption most of you, if done this, probably seen the Chainlink box already. But just to kind of call out the process for it. Now this is working to the assumption you have Truffle installed already. Worth noting that, there can be, compatibility, Node.js compatibility version quirks. I've run into some with, depending on what the box is using and the versions of things that the box is dependent on. Just to, I won't kind of delve into that anymore. Happy to answer questions as I go through the hackathon if you have them around kind of that particular topic, because it can be a bit sticky at times, and I've wrestled with it a lot. So I potentially unstick you quite quickly if you do run into kind of weird version compatibility things. But either way, putting that aside for now, the process for unboxing, as I called out, is Truffle unbox, and in the case of the Chainlink box, smart contract kit / box, and then that will pull down everything. Really behind the scenes, it's just doing a git clone. And then with the key difference that there's I forget the exact term, but like a post install script that can optionally be run. And then typically that will do like, a npm or yarn install of all the dependencies, but potentially other things as well. A lot of the boxes will kind of spin up other stuff. So really it will just kind of alleviate the kind of perhaps manual process of getting the box ready for, whatever, the given context of the box does. So once that's done, usually takes, depending on the size of the box and its associated, kind of dependencies, it takes a moment or two. And in the case of the Chainlink box, what I would typically do is then go to the develop console. Now, you may or may not have used the develop console that much in the past, but it's pretty neat just because it kind of essentially mounts yourself at, the point where you don't need to then do Truffle, the name of the command. You can start firing off commands directly. And it mounts a Web3 instance as well. So you can start to, if you don't mind using Web3, of course, start to actually fire off transactions or other types of things. So in this case, we could do Truffle develop. That doesn't really reflect it on that little graphic down here. You then see the prompt change a little bit because you're at kind of essentially kind of the Truffle REPL of sorts or console. And you can then just literally type migrate, and then that will behind the scenes compile the contracts if they're not compiled already, or or if they need to be recompiled, and then actually do the migration. And in the case of develop, in Truffle develop, it will actually spin up a GANACHE instance for you as well. So you don't need to separately do that unless you want to use GANACHE like UI and whatever else. But if you don't and you just want to almost the fastest path to just test out the box and the contracts and whatever else it does, you can Truffle develop and then migrate. And then in the case of the Chainlink box, then to kind of get it to actually do anything, there are a few scripts that you need to run by design, to kind of walk you through sort of setting stuff up. So again, if you're at the console via Truffle develop, you can then just do exec, and then in this case, the script names. And then that will just kind of, and again, I won't kind of prescriptively go through this because A, you might have seen it, and B, you know, it's, you know, you can sort of look at it in your own time. But yeah, a side note as well, if you're doing this on Truffle develop, e.g., you know, on a local GANACHE instance, it won't, as far as I know, and I haven't delved into this too much, you won't see the Chainlink nodes that it's referencing won't update the local data in the contract by the Oracle, just because it's running locally. There may be caveats to that, so I'll just kind of leave it at that. But it will show, you know, walk you through the process, and from a learning, and of course in the README for this box, it shows you how to do it on mainnet, where you can get access to real data and so on. And we'll talk more about that theme as well as we go through on like GANACHE forking, you know, differences that will bring, or the benefits that will bring. Anyway, yeah, the goal here at this point was just to sort of show the kind of box process, specifically the Chainlink one. As a side note, and this is actually partly for Patrick as well, these exec commands that are running here would be really nice as plugins, because then you would essentially get the ability to kind of do, if you're either Truffle run, if you're not in the console, and then, you know, a much more kind of elegant wrapper on top of these scripts, and the ability to pass in different parameters to these contracts as well. And I'll be talking about this, but as I was going through this box, I was like, oh, I need to tell Patrick this would be a cool cool as a plugin, because essentially it'd be the same thing. It'd be running these, you know, these scripts, but it could be wrapped up in one thing. Like, so it could be like, and this is, you know, for everyone's benefit, if it was packaged as a plugin, and I'll show this in a bit, then you could do like run box, or, you know, run Chainlink fund, run Chainlink request, run Chainlink read, Chainlink being the command, you know, the run command name or the plugin name. So a kind of more elegant kind of layer on top, essentially to, you know, run scripts behind the scenes. I saw Patrick's video flash on there. So yeah, cool. But I'll unpack, I know that I went through that a little bit rapidly, so I'll back up on that in a moment. And I think it's actually the next segment. Cool, so let me just check. I don't think I've seen any questions come through just yet. Nope, all good. Yeah, just as a, you know, shout out there, you know, if any questions coming up as I'm going through this, you know, just throw them in the Q&A. All right, moving on. Oh, final thing of this kind of, this sort of beginner-ish section was just some resources for getting started with Truffle. Again, if you're a little bit newer to it, or you're coming from a, you know, another chain, another dev tooling, you know, then the three things, at least official things that we, you know, have for, you know, as resources for getting started with Truffle are as follows. So our docs, you know, I'm exactly the set, like very rarely like start by looking at docs. I've got to do other things first, but our docs are pretty reasonable. You know, patchy in places, but, you know, certainly if you're getting started, they're pretty great, I would say. We have some good tutorials as well, specifically the pet shop tutorial. It's a little dated, but if you are brand new to, you know, Ethereum and the space, it's a good one to kind of just guide you through the process, you know, pretty slowly. And it's something we are actually in the progress of updating. So, you know, watch this space. There'll be a kind of all revamped pet shop tutorial if you've seen it before and yeah, this is a bit old now. And then lastly, as I mentioned, the boxes, you know, can't recommend them enough as a means of just kind of, you know, browsing around, finding the one that's kind of relevant in your context and kind of using that as a means to learn or as a kind of boilerplate for a project. All right, so kind of now we'll shift gears to the kind of more intermediate to advanced stuff. Yeah, let's dive into that. So yeah, good. I mentioned this earlier, I kind of built myself up to it. So something called Truffle plugins, starting there. By the way, the order with this is I kind of just bundled in a bunch of stuff. So I don't know whether the order of what I'm going through now is like optimal, but you know, so treat it as such as just like good nuggets of knowledge, or hopefully good and useful, you know, and kind of join it together after the fact if you need to. Okay, so plugins. Yeah, what are they first? I alluded to this already, but just to kind of call it out more specifically, they're a means of extending Truffle's functionality through, you know, a sort of new command that will run in the context of Truffle itself. Very easy to, you know, sort of, well, both, I say very, I mean, it's just a couple of steps, and that's something we're kind of looking at as well, just how to just make this kind of DX or developer experience as, you know, optimal as it can be. But either way, as it stands right now, it's not that hard. It's just kind of 2 steps. So you would, you know, whatever the plugin's name is, you would just npm or yarn, you know, yarn add. it. And then the only kind of second step, which is, I think, a little bit cumbersome, but not hard, is you just need to add that line, the little plugins config. You can see there kind of midway down into your Truffle config. What that will then do is allow whatever the plugin's called, allow you to then run it as Truffle run and then the name of the plugin. Either directly from the root of your CLI, or if you're at the console, you can just do run and then the name of the plugin. One thing I don't think I call out here is that you can also pass in parameters to it, n number as well. So as I was kind of mentioning earlier, in the case of perhaps the Chainlink one, and the nice thing about, I should stress as well, in the context of a box, you could have this as, say in the context of the Chainlink box, have this as a dependency, in your package.json and in the Truffle config already. So immediately, as soon as the box is unboxed, then there's nothing else folks would need to do. So immediately they can then just do Truffle run, similar to the exec, command, but it's just more elegant because of the fact you could just have a single command like Truffle run link, and then different parameters that you pass into it. So link, say like fund, and then perhaps additional parameter there. What are you funding, etc. So it would just make for a much more kind of graceful developer experience on top of essentially, in the case of the Chainlink one, like underlying sort of bespoke scripts, which is okay, but this would arguably is a little more kind of slick. So that high level is what they are, and then as I kind of mentioned already, they're really easy to create your own. A few caveats. Our documentation on these right now is almost non-existent. Now that's going to change. I'm going to make sure that in the next few weeks we have at least something on it, because we really don't right now, as far as I know, and I think I do know, just from having looked thoroughly through our documentation. It's just something that, because these came into existence in Truffle v5, so it's not brand new, and I think it just got overlooked at the time to kind of add some docs to it. It was more of a kind of side feature that just never happened. So that's going to change. But what we do have is some good resources out there. We actually have a plugin that I wrote, that URL there. If obviously you can get the slides, and I can send it in the chat if you need it. This is one I actually wrote for a hackathon relatively recently, and it's actually a wrapper on top of Pinata, which is an IPFS pinning service. If you're not familiar with it, it's pretty neat. And I called it Caramel, just a fun name in the Truffle theme. But again, that's not the point. The point is you can sort of see it a little bit more in action. Once you've got it installed, you can then just do Truffle run Caramel, like say upload. And that takes some, if you don't specify a parameter there, it will, oh gosh, I think it just uploads your build artifacts as a default, which is semi-sensible default. But if you do press the parameter in, you can specify whatever path you want. So if you wanted to upload and pin your front end, the front end to your dApp, and then you can do that. So, and then you can list all the things you've pinned through, Pinata, essentially to IPFS, and they're pinning it on your behalf. And then you can unpin as well. Again, the context isn't so important. It's more just that's a good resource. And I've shared it with other folks recently, and they've used that as an example, to kind of build some plugins. So yeah, that's the main goal we're here. And we also have some really good third-party guides out there. So Roscoe Callis, if you're familiar with him, he's written one that allows you to, from the CLI, from Truffle, verify contracts on Etherscan. And he has a good guide on how to do it as well, which puts the fact that we don't have anything on it to shame. What we do have, though, is a guide which I think alludes to plugins. I think there at that top link and under the additional resources, really about writing external scripts. So that will still be a thing, because that's useful. But I think, in my opinion, plugins are a kind of more graceful way, or elegant way, and more powerful way, for that you can kind of pass in parameters to them. So yeah, another hackathon idea as well. And I think this is a really good one, depending on what you're doing, just because, again, it's so easy to bundle, so if you are working on a hack that does X, and if there's value in it kind of playing nicely with Truffle, then wrapping it as a plugin is really, really easy. And again, that would allow people to kind of run it in the context of Truffle, perhaps as part of a dev workflow. Again, if that makes sense, but it's low hanging fruit as a functional thing. And if you want assistance with this anytime throughout the hackathon, just reach out. Happy to give guidance on it. Cool. Let me just check. I'm not missing any questions. I see one. Okay. So is it possible to have multiple versions of dependencies in Solidity contract? We compile and deploy in a single command. I'll come back to that one just because it's a little bit off topic and so on. Not in a bad way, but just to, just to keep the flow. But yeah, I'll kind of go through all the questions, if they're a bit like outside of the flow at the end, because I'll make sure we've got some time. Cool. All right. But yeah, keep them flowing in as well. Okay, so moving on. So that's plugins in this kind of grab bag of kind of intermediate things. Next up was GANACHE forking. Just to kind of recap what GANACHE is, if you've not used it yet, or perhaps knowingly used it, it's a local Ethereum node, designed for development. However, just kind of to provide context for what forking provides as a feature, when you run a GANACHE instance, it's empty. You essentially 0 blocks to start with, and they're either insta-mined, which is the default. So when you send transactions to that GANACHE instance, they'll be instantly mined, which is kind of nice from a dev perspective. Obviously not realistic in the real world, but you can change that as well as a config for GANACHE. However, re-emphasizing the point that it's empty, and until you start deploying contracts to it and doing things with those contracts. However, what that's kind of segueing us to what GANACHE forking is. It's the ability to take a snapshot of another chain, and that's very often mainnet, but not always. But it can be. It doesn't have to be mainnet. Is the point? It could be a testnet or like a permissioned node, or if you're running a consortium network or whatever it might be, and interact with that as if it's running locally. Now, I often think as a good sort of analog is to think of Git, perhaps in the Git repository that's hosted on GitHub that you don't have permission to write back to, and you take a fork of that. And again, I'm sure you've seen that, probably done it, where you can click fork, and it will take an exact snapshot of that Git repository over to your username or your org, and you can then start working with it. Awesome, working with all the commits that have been ever added in that in the life of that project. However, you can't write back to it. So that's key, and probably stating the obvious, right? Because of course, if you take a fork of mainnet and you can work with it and start, interacting with contracts, in a context perhaps that you don't have permission to do so, or you take over an account that has like 1 million DAI, of course you can't then transfer that and then send it to an account that you own, and then kind of in quotes write that back to mainnet. Obviously, it doesn't work that way, but it does allow you to kind of work with that, as if you are, kind of in kind of God mode of, of mainnet, which is really, really powerful, I guess for obvious reasons, but, just to, perhaps compare how you might do that in, if you wanted to kind of write, compose a kind of composed service that interacts with mainnet without doing GANACHE forking. And there are cases where you would still use these other techniques. You might work with a testnet, or you might kind of mock up those, take copies of those contracts, pump them to a empty GANACHE instance, and then sort of mock data and stuff. But it's cumbersome, right? And it's not kind of reflective of the real world, in quotes. So really, this is a really, really powerful technique for kind of simulating mainnet or real world kind of state, and interacting with it in a way that you perhaps don't have, and you get the benefits of the speed, and kind of insta mining blocks and all those kind of benefits of of GANACHE as a standalone tool. I just called out here availability. It's actually a feature that's been in GANACHE for a few years now, but it's kind of in this new kind of world that's emerged, I guess, with DeFi and the fact we're kind of building these awesome kind of composed services where you kind of connect to other contracts and interact with them and so on. This is really powerful. Perhaps a few years ago it wasn't as needed because things were operating a bit more standalone. So yeah, it's it's been around for a little while. And in fact, this slide's a little bit out of date because it says it's in the next Teams release. It's actually, we have forking in Truffle Teams, so you can spin up a forked instance. Okay, so let me just make sure. Oh, I guess there's one caveat as well. You need to, which I don't call out here, I don't think, is you need to fork from a node that's running in archival mode. So that's a pretty big caveat in some senses, without mentioning Truffle Teams, because that's a feature we have now. But you couldn't just point it at like or like an Infura node without having access to they do have an archival node tier, but out of the box the kind of free tier doesn't, as far as I know at least, doesn't provide that. Cloudflare, as hosted service does. I haven't used it extensively, so whether it's fully comprehensive, I'm not sure. There's known issues with it, but the kind of high-level testing I've done against Cloudflare's gateway is that it does work. So just kind of call out the command in that context. You can see Ganache CLI if we were just doing Ganache standalone, the fork flag, -- fork, and then the link, to the RPC URL to the node that's running in archival mode. But somewhat moot, because as we'll see in Teams, when you spin up a Ganache sandbox, and I'll explain what those are, you can can run it in as a fork of mainnet, there and then. So that's really useful from a feature standpoint. Okay, so in action, and this will actually kind of build up to us seeing it running in Teams. We do have that as a thing, as I kind of mentioned. Sorry, a little bit disjointed in terms of the flow here. I wasn't trying to do some grand unveil or anything, but it is a feature of Teams that when you create a sandbox, and what sandboxes are is kind of cloud-based or kind of hosted Ganache instances, which is pretty neat in and of itself. When you create one, you can then just, as you can see here on this left-hand graphic, when you create a new sandbox, essentially a Ganache instance, hosted on on Teams, you can choose to fork it, and you can choose the network, so that can be mainnet or any of the test nets. There may be a reason you wanted to fork from a test net, and then exactly as I said, that will then essentially take a snapshot behind the scenes. It doesn't kind of synchronize all the state, by the way, because obviously that would be multiple terabytes, but it will kind of talk back to that network to get given state as needed. So depending on the contract that you're interacting with, it will kind of talk back and get what it needs behind the scenes for you. So just to kind of clarify that in case how does that work? That sounds ridiculous. And then from a config, Truffle config perspective, if you had created a Teams or Ganache sandbox on Truffle Teams, then it will give you don't see it on this left-hand screenshot here, but once you've created one, you'll get the RPC URL. You can just paste that into your as a network in your Truffle config, typically where you perhaps reference your dev nodes and mainnet as well. You can also and then often I might call it fork or Teams, and then you can then use that network at any given time here, and then again in this case it's a fork of mainnet, so you can kind of test your contracts against that. So from a kind of workflow perspective, that's really neat. Or you can, in the bottom here of this slide, you can Truffle console -- network, and then the name, in this case fork, and then that will give you a Truffle develop console that you could then migrate your contracts to, etc., and test against them, execute scripts, and so on. So that, and in this case, it's still a Ganache instance, hosted in the cloud in quotes, but it's forked from mainnet. Sorry, I kind of jumped through that pretty rapidly. Hopefully that made sense. If you've got the kind of requisite background knowledge, but if any clarifications on it, throw in questions, and/or happy to jump on a quick chat or call offline if you kind of have questions that bubble up on it. Because a lot of words and things there, but hopefully they just made sense. So that's kind of showing it in action, or how you would do it. Now in the context of the kind of jumping back to the Chainlink box, again, kind of doing what we kind of saw briefly earlier on, and I don't show it kind of running kind of real, just trying to steer away from too much live stuff just because time's quite short. But yeah, let's say we unbox the Chainlink box, and rather than now just doing Truffle develop to open up the console and then migrate to the local Ganache instance, we could run that command that we saw on the prior slide, so the one down the bottom here, and then we can then do migrate again. In this case, it will migrate it to a Teams instance, or Teams Ganache instance. But if this is forked, then when you actually start to kind of run through the steps here, you should be able to get the live data in this case. I haven't actually tested this one specifically myself, but that's something that should just work, because it's equivalent of you running it against a mainnet node in this case, with some caveats that I haven't tested that. But you can see just kind of showing you the flow here of kind of how easy it is to do this. But certainly, so again, caveat that I haven't tested it with, in the context of the box. I have tested it with lots of other projects and contracts, and as as mentioned, you can get at real, real data, real on-chain contracts, kind of interact with them, etc. So really, really powerful as a feature. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving on from that, just because there's just conscious of time, and still a bit more I wanted to cover. But just on that topic of forking and so on, any questions, just shout, kind of either now or reach out to me after. Happy to help. All right. So next kind of topic type technique is something which is kind of related to the forking in a sense, in that we can, and in this case, the context is debugging a contract that, again, has already been deployed to either a testnet or mainnet. And perhaps this is one you just want to kind of replay and step through, because maybe it was not a contract you own, or it might be, by own I mean deployed yourself, and maybe there's an issue with it, or you just want to sort of step through the code just to see what's going on, from a learning standpoint. It's a really, really powerful technique, and again, pretty new. I think it's a couple of months old as a feature. And yeah, kind of title of it, debugging verified contracts. What do we mean by that? It allows you to debug a transaction on any network that you have kind of access to. By that I mean public network, without needing the source to it, because this kind of parameter or flag that you pass in will kind of instruct the debugger to go to Etherscan or Sourcify and pull down the contracts from there. So we'll kind of just sort of unpacking that a little bit further. This will only work if the contracts have been verified on either Etherscan or through Sourcify. And I feel like another big thing I was going to say, but it escapes me right now. I guess, and then behind the scenes, it will actually compile those, and then kind of allow you to actually start stepping through from a debug standpoint, immediately. And I may jump across and show this in a moment, because it's really, really neat. I mean, it can take a moment just because it has to make a few calls to the Etherscan API, for example, to get the contracts, do the compilations, and then mount the debugger and so on. But it's where it can potentially be really, really worth it, because otherwise to do construct all that yourself locally, but pulling down these contracts, even though you have the access to the source and all the ABIs and so on, is cumbersome to say the least, because you're dealing with different potentially Solidity compiler versions and so on. So it's painful. This just makes what would otherwise be really cumbersome to debug a transaction super painless. And I guess, again, kind of alluded to it, but didn't call it out specifically, just need a transaction hash for any given transaction. So you can see that down here. And yeah, that's what you'll get. I may just jump over to VS Code and show this one, because that's, once you kind of run that command, then it will, right now, by the way, it does it on the, like the CLI debugger, which, it's okay. I mean, to be honest, it's not as visual as it could be. We have the visual debugger about to go live in Truffle Teams. It's actually something I've been working on personally, and I'll perhaps show a sneak peek of that. But either way, this is this is more than good enough just for debugging a given transaction, perhaps one that you don't even haven't written, and you just want to kind of unpack what's going on, or it's failed, or whatever it might be. And we have a good blog post on it at the bottom there. I'll quickly show it. Let me just jump across to VS Code here. Sorry, wrong ones. Let me just, there we go. All right, I think I had it ready to show. And again, I'm conscious this is tiny. I'll just pull it up here a bit. So that command I've just thrown in down there. And so it's truffle debug, transaction hash, the network, which is, oh, I didn't stress as well, and this is why I perhaps mentioned that in the same similar context to GANACHE forking, that I'm actually pointing this at my Teams instance right now, which is, sorry, my Teams hosted GANACHE instance, which is forked from mainnet. So I'm actually debugging a contract. This was a transaction hash for one of the Chainlink transactions. So I just found, I think I just dug into the Chainlink, the ERC20s on Etherscan, just looked at the recent transactions, copied the transaction hash and just pasted it in here. And you can see now, I've not done anything else. I don't know what the source is. I haven't looked at the source for these given contracts. And then I can just start to step through here. You can see in.
Could you zoom in just a hair?
Yeah, I might. Yeah, I will. I'm conscious it'll probably start. I've got some weirdness. Is that? There we go.
Oh yeah.
Okay, that wasn't so bad. I've kind of built up this kind of nervousness about zooming in because my fan starts to like. I should do it in advance. There's been, well, more specifically, I've been doing some training recently where I was like zoomed in and just my machine is ground to a halt. And I think it's probably just because I've got too many VS Code instances running with too many tabs, and it's just like having to kind of repaint or re-render them all. And I'm like, oh man, my machine just like locked up. And I may have even done that now. It seems to be okay. Yeah, sorry, but thanks for asking that, Patrick. So anyway, hopefully you can just about see that. And this is a really nice one just to test out yourself because it's super easy. But you can see here, I'm just kind of so it's a little bit manual. You have to sort of get familiar with the keys, the commands here, like to step over, step into, out, etc. So I was just stepping. I think I just stepped out of everything there. But you can just see that it's stepping through that. These multiple contracts kind of jumping in and out of different files. Oh, maybe it's all in the same one, that EAC aggregator proxy. But yeah, I think if I'd have stepped into it, or jumped into some of the other, contracts that this EAC aggregator proxy was importing and inheriting from. So yeah, or implementing, I should say. So either way, super kind of powerful as a technique there. And again, from a learning standpoint and or troubleshooting and so on. Okay, how are we doing on time? About 10 minutes left. So, all right, next tool, and I've kind of mentioned, obviously, or kind of alluded to some of the features in Truffle Teams. But again, from a hackathon perspective, but hopefully it will be actually very useful. Just to kind of back up again and sort of reframe what it is. It's everything kind of on that right-hand side of the build workflow. So, one thing as we were kind of, Truffle's evolved as a suite of tools, we became kind of aware of is that, the story that we have, for, as I said earlier, things on that kind of right-hand side of this kind of build workflow or development lifecycle was just patchy. It's not that we had like zero story for, for them, but it wasn't like as robust as it perhaps could or should be. So over time, that led us to think, well, there's perhaps a need for a tool, to kind of that plays nicely with Truffle, as the suite itself, but adds value to very important steps of building a DApp and particularly kind of maintaining and kind of operating and so on. So that led us to start building teams, a little bit of kind of history on and kind of rationale, kind of on the or sort of the reasoning behind it. Just to briefly unpack, if you sort of tore through in terms of screenshots, and features, to give some context, I'll perhaps jump in again, conscious of time, and just kind of show it momentarily as well. But the first one, and again, I've mentioned these already, and this is the sandboxes, or specifically the GANACHE sandboxes. So these are hosted instances of GANACHE for you. Really, really powerful. If you want to share something with someone, because it's in the cloud, as it were, and obviously when you're running GANACHE locally, it's not. So it's fine from a dev standpoint, but if you then say, hey, you want to quickly test it out together, you take on the role of X, I'll be Y, and let's see how this works. Now, of course, you can do that on the test net, but that again, you need test ether, and it's just a bit slower and so on. So the nice thing about this is just makes that takes away that that pain there. Just one click, you spin up an instance, and you can see on this screenshot here, you get the RPC URL for it, and then paste that into your Truffle config and migrate to it, as we were sort of alluding to earlier, and off you go. So it's really, really neat from that standpoint. Oh, and they can be forked. I don't call that out here, which is again even more adds even more value to them if you want to work against mainnet data there. So we have also it's kind of rapidly going through the features, and this one may be useful from a hackathon standpoint. And this is a sort of lightweight CI service. So what this will do, as upon any commit, it will just pull down the latest contracts from GitHub. To obviously connected your GitHub account to it and given it permission to this particular repository, and it will then trigger a build and run the tests and spit out the output of those tests. So again, just simple in that sense, but powerful, particularly if you do using TDD or another sort of wherein you've written your tests first, or even if you've written them kind of sort of a little bit more retrospectively, you know, and you're adding some more features, you just want to see the state of things. You know, if someone else has inadvertently, caused a test, caused the test to fail. So again, definitely useful in kind of bigger team type scenarios. I had a kind of demo here of this, but I may or may not show it just in the interest of time, just so we kind of come in on time. What I was going to show is just I've inadvertently broken simple storage, which is a kind of hello world type contract, which you may have seen before. And then I was just going to commit in line here, which you would never normally do. And then that would trigger this would cause this build to pass. But again, it's super contrived, but it just shows it in action. So I'll kind of move over it just because it's not that important to see, and we're coming up to time as well. We also have, well, kind of moving on from that, at least, we have a visual deployer as well. So, once you've built on the team side, and I can just show this here, I could then go ahead and deploy. I've obviously broken it, but I don't have to deploy this broken instance if I don't want to. I can, typically you would obviously perhaps always want me making sure that all the tests pass and then, deploy from there, but you can then go ahead and deploy to, as you can see, either, any of the, public, networks, mainnet down, or your Ganache instances directly from here. Now you could do this from the CLI as well. If you got the RPC URL, you could just kind of migrate to that from your local instance, so your local computer. But it's nice to be able to just kind of pump it straight over here. Funnily named, they get randomly assigned names. So I always often try and get funny ones just by refreshing the name. And then that connect wallet only applies if you're deploying to a public network. Otherwise, it will just work. You'll just do it. But you can see there, and then the contracts are on, in this case, perhaps my sandbox instance. And then you can, wire up the front end or whatever. So it's really kind of cool from a workflow standpoint. And then, debugger sneak peek, I guess. So this is about to go live imminently, and this is a visual debugger. You'll see this is just running locally on my kind of local / remote dev environment. And this isn't actually the best example because we're doing some stress testing on it here. But this, if I just kind of, I didn't prepare this in advance, so I don't even know if this is running correctly. But you can see here is I probably shouldn't have hit restart there, but because I don't know if the dev environment's running, because we use remote dev environments. But either way, you got the idea. Oh, there we go. So this is essentially a kind of visual wrapper on top of the command, the CLI debugger that you saw earlier. So you can debug transactions, and this may not work because I actually have a feeling my remote dev environment, isn't running there. I'll come back to that in a sec. But you can, as you'd expect it to be in terms of a debugger, not dissimilar to others that are out there, but this would immediately allow you to start debugging transactions that you've run on your sandboxes. And although this won't be going live immediately, but kind of imminently after on any network. So pretty powerful. Just have like a nice visual debugger in the context of all the other things that Teams provides. Okay, so that's the debugger sneak peek. And then lastly, just in terms of Teams, we have a kind of big pipeline of features. Some of these are actually already live as well. The dashboard, for example. So yeah, we'd love feedback on this. It's a relatively new tool for us. Something we're putting sort of some reasonable amount of energy into, and I think hopefully in the context of the hackathon, that there's some value there. I think particularly the sandbox feature is really powerful. If you're building some contracts and wanted to run them against a Ganache, a forked Ganache instance, kind of that is potentially a killer feature from a dev perspective. Cool. All right, so we're kind of coming up to time and coming in just on time before we jump over to Q&A. So I was going to say some next steps, for kind of where do you go from here from some of these features, or what we've covered. I guess firstly, is any questions with any of the above? I'm conscious I went quite quickly because I crammed in a lot. But if that left like lingering questions I don't get to answer now, e.g. if stuff comes up after, or when you try some of this stuff out and it's like, whoa, what's going on here? It's broken or whatever, or just unclear, reach out. I'll just put my email address up there, ping me anytime. Or raise it. We have a Truffle, this isn't listed here, but we have a Truffle Slack community. We use Spectrum, we have Stack Overflow that we monitor, etc. But arguably the quickest way, particularly in the context of a hackathon, is to just reach out direct. So by all means do that anytime. If you're interested in contributing to Truffle or any of the things that we have, all the open source stuff is it's just kind of putting that link up there. We have some contributing guidelines. We have lots of good, well curated issues, good first issues, help wanted, labels, labeled things and stuff. So again, if you're interested in that, or in any way contributing or collaborating, reach out to. And then lastly, final thing before we jump over to Q&A is we have a conference coming up called TruffleCon. This is going to be the third year, in line pretty much with everything going on in the world right now. We've shifted it to virtual. Historically, they've been in person. I'm personally a fan of virtual, particularly just because it means you can attend from wherever you are in the world. The downside, obviously, of in person is that it's in a physical location, and it might be tough for folks to fly in. And costly as well. So anyway, this year it's virtual and it's free. We have some paid tiers, where you get extra stuff if you want, but the bulk of it is going to be free. So if you're interested in it, it's at trufflesuite.com/TruffleCon 2020. I think we've started to announce the speakers. We have some awesome speakers as well. Some really awesome folks from the community. So yeah, definitely attend. Love to see you there. So with that, unless there's unless there's anything I need to backtrack on, we'll jump over to Q&A, and we kind of come in just at time as well. So, and again, anything I don't get to answer now, just to reemphasize that last point, definitely reach out, with questions as you're going through the hackathon. I'll leave this slide open as I go to Q&A as well, just if you want to kind of write down my email address or jot that down. Cool. All right, I'll take a breath, and with that, I'll jump over to questions. So first one, which I didn't actually see earlier when I jumped in, was from Brendan. Can you publish these presentation slides for us afterwards? Yeah, definitely. I'll pass them over to Patrick, and he can share them with everyone. And then the next one from Jevan Jot, assuming I'm pronouncing that correctly. Sorry if I got it a bit wrong. Is it possible to have multiple versions of dependencies in Solidity contracts and compile and deploy in a single command? Yes, I think is the easy answer to that. Ping me about that one if you've got a specific example, because I could perhaps walk you through the process there, assuming I'm interpreting that correctly. Because I assume you're talking about like importing other contracts, perhaps from a library, OpenZeppelin or something. So you just followed up, so you used OpenZeppelin. Let's take that one offline if you want to reach out, and I can kind of help you kind of troubleshoot that one. I just sort of been signed out there. I don't know what's going on. I'll stop sharing now as well. So yeah, cool. But reach out about that one if you kind of happy to kind of help you kind of walk through that. But you should be able to. Cool. So any more? Oh yeah, just so. Cool. Alrighty. So with that, I think we are kind of done. We're just at time, just ever so slightly over. Thank you for having me. And I hope everyone, good luck with your hacks, and can't wait to see them, because I think I'm assuming nothing's changed. Myself and Josh are going to be on the judging panel as well. So I'm super excited to see what everyone builds.
Awesome. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for being here. Really excited to see how the engineers take what they learned and apply it to their projects. So thank you again.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having me, Patrick. And thanks, guys. Yeah, and best of luck.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Cheers,
Talk
guys.
to you soon.
See you later. Bye-bye.